From Synozur, this is Polaris. I'm Chris McNulty. Software continues to change the world, but how is it invented and designed? In an era of daily growth, large organizations are struggling to tame massive amounts of content. IDC projects we'll reach 175 zettabytes of data globally this year, making it harder than ever to find what you need. Today, we'll talk to Sean Squires, Principal Product Manager for Microsoft, about the journey from inspiration to innovation and customer delight. He'll share what it's like to design content management products that are used by hundreds of millions of people every day. This is Polaris. Welcome to Polaris Pathways. I'm your host, Chris McNulty, Chief Technology Officer at Synozur. Synozur, the transformation company, transforms business for our clients, navigating strategies and leadership culture with ease. Today, I'm happy to introduce our guest, Sean Squires. He's a Principal Product Manager at Microsoft, focusing on SharePoint and Content AI. But before we hear from Sean, let's set the stage and define our terms and our data points. We'll have a lot of insights, and of course, all of our references will be included in the show notes. We talked earlier about that IDC projection of 175 zettabytes. How big is that? Let's put it into perspective. That's 175 trillion gigabytes, or a 175 followed by 21 zeros. Now imagine printing all of that data on paper. You'd need roughly 35 quintillion sheets, or 35 billion pages. If you stacked all those pages up, your pile would be about 1.8 light years high. In simple terms, that's a stack of paper reaching nearly halfway to the closest star beyond our sun. 3/4 of that giant pile is unstructured documents and images. 90% of unstructured data is never even analyzed. So, not a surprise, it's harder than ever to find your content in the cloud. One trend that's helping is the surge in intelligent document processing, or IDP, essentially using AI to automate reading and routing of documents. IDP can turn piles of contracts or forms into structured data in seconds. It's booming. The global IDP market is growing over 37.5% annually, jumping from 1.1 billion 3 years ago to 5.2 billion by 2027. Why the rapid growth? Businesses are drowning in that surge of content we talked about before, from invoices and finance to patient records and healthcare. AI-driven document processing offers a lifeline by eliminating manual data entry, cutting costs, and cutting errors. Beyond processing documents, AI is supercharging content management and collab. Modern content platforms, like SharePoint, are embedding AI to help organize information and even create content. AI can help by automatically classifying and tagging documents based on their content, making them easier to find later. It can also pull out important details. For example, an AI model can scan an invoice and extract the vendor name, amount, and due date into metadata fields without any human effort. Another cool innovation that our guest worked on today is autofill. That's a feature in SharePoint that lets you add a custom column to a document library, which auto-populates based on a prompt. You could ask, summarize this document in one sentence, or who is the main contact for this project? And the AI will fill that column for every file in the library. No more reading each file one by one. AI extracts and generates the answer for you at scale. This doesn't just save time, it improves content findability, and it improves the quality of what goes in to generative AI systems like Copilot. We've covered this long enough. Sean is waiting in our virtual green room to share his expertise, so let's go. So today on Polaris, I am excited to be joined by longtime friend of the program and longtime friend, Sean Squires from Microsoft. Sean, welcome to Polaris.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
Sean, can you just take a minute and introduce yourself to the audience?
I am a product manager in the OneDrive SharePoint team and have been working for many years on content, specifically things around doc libraries, bringing AI more into the document libraries for processing content, And prior to that, I did a lot of work, as some people may be familiar with, site templates and automated configuration. So I would say that one of the areas I've been working on for a long time in the SharePoint team, and that's been most of my 20-year career at Microsoft, is working around how to better organize and make findable one's content that's stored in SharePoint. And that dovetails really nicely with the work I did even before I got to Microsoft. I used to work with startups around, content management, ECM systems, and things like that. Early precursor days, machine learned AI models, things like this. And so
What I
it
don't know what
suits
you're.
my interest well. Yeah.
Uh, AI was invented 2 years ago. I'm not sure what you're talking about.
We used to train very old data sets and taxonomies and things like this to tag content for better findability and improve search. It's been a long journey, but you're right. The cool AI is 2 years old.
It's interesting. We were talking about this a bit. I was at a conference in Atlanta last week, the AI
Yeah.
plus IM Summit, as I mentioned to you. And there was a discussion about like new AI versus old AI, and
Yeah.
especially the importance of empathy in that transition, because there are people who are just not willing to let AI have a central role in how they author content in business.
Mm.
And I pointed to two examples. Like on one hand, to borrow from sports, in Major League Baseball, you can put a chip in a baseball, and the computer can do a much better job with AI of telling you whether something's a ball or a strike. But people are not really ready to do that. They want to keep the human in the element, and you have to respect that. But at the same
Yep.
time, for years, we're totally fine letting Apple Maps or Google Maps tell us when to turn left and when to turn right.
Yeah.
You've been on a journey, and you and I have worked together both before, during, and after my time at Microsoft. One thing I think is great to shed a light on is kind of what is the role of the product manager, because I think from
Mm.
the outside in, there's an assumption that everyone of the product team is heads down coding and development all the time. I certainly know after my time at Microsoft that's not the case. So talk to me a little bit about, how do you shape and design products that you're not coding?
Across the industry, there's lots of different types of product managers. And even within Microsoft, there's different product manager roles. People that are more business focused, people that are more systems focused, and then people like myself who are more product focused. And uh, what I love is, and by the way, in my tenure at Microsoft, even my discipline has evolved and changed quite a bit over the years. We didn't have a strong design emphasis until we really started modernizing SharePoint about 10 years ago. And right now, we really have a really strong triad of development, design, and product management. And fundamentally, I don't think the product manager responsibilities have change that much. I mean, I'm dangerous with some coding, but yeah, I'm not writing the code. But I think my role is to really oversee that product lifecycle from ideation to launch, like helping to define and map the business goals with the actual technical feasibility and working with design to figure out how to fit a design that makes sense to a customer within those technical parameters and bring that thing those ideas to life. And
Yeah, yeah.
it's it's yeah, go ahead.
The
Yeah,
best
yeah.
analogy I can draw is, if you're familiar with how the recording process works, not this, but like commercial music.
Mm.
You have the role of a producer. They're not performing, they're not singing, they're not writing the music, they're not even engineering the recording, but they're there to kind of ensure that it all comes together, that the inputs and the outputs all make cohesive sense, and that you're going to
Right.
get a much better product at the end, instead of like pressing record on a tape recorder and hoping for the best.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you agree with that
That's
analogy?
absolutely, yeah, because I think you know we all have our different strengths and different you know uh, perspectives that we can bring to the product. And I think, fundamentally, you mentioned, empathy earlier. I think that customer empathy is really at the cornerstone of software development, probably at the cornerstone of a lot of things. I mean, to build good product that makes sense to people, you need those different perspectives and that empathy to really understand what the customer is trying to do, what their requirements are. And I think, you know, a developer is going to be great at optimizing the code to make that happen. A designer is going to be really great at designing experiences that are intuitive and user understandable. And I think where the product manager comes in is helping to understand how to bring those pieces together, how to do that translation. I
Yeah.
think that being able to translate those business requirements, those customer requirements, to something that you can actually build that will work within your system. And that's where
Right.
enterprise software development becomes super important. We're not building a one off thing, we're building something that's a part of a system. You need to make all those things work together. And that's where I think where the PM has a vital role.
I didn't actually plan it to work out this way, but we were talking about the role of a music producer, and the person
Yeah,
who sort of carved out that role most famously originally was George Martin, the producer of the Beatles. And I didn't really intend it to go this way, but one of the Beatles' most elaborate productions ever was on the Sgt. Pepper album, a song called A Day in the Life.
that's
So,
right.
having
That's right.
said that, I'd love to understand for you. I'm sure no 2 days are the same. What is a typical day in the life of a product manager?
Uh, it's a great segue there. The short answer is a lot of meetings, Chris. No. um, it depends on the day, but generally, I'm working on a number of projects in my portfolio,
Mhm.
and that involves coordinating with a variety of people across different teams and disciplines. But a typical day will be meeting with people to do anything from review designs to look at code as it's in development to a lot of writing, because we're managing and prioritizing the workload through ADO. We're writing specifications. We're reviewing those specifications, and so a lot of it is just really taking what you could imagine taking a product from an idea on a whiteboard or in a team chat and turning it into something that is in the product. And so the variety of meetings, it goes across those disciplines and varies day to day.
Yeah, I'd also imagine that, the meetings are going to morph kind of based on where you are in the evolution of the product for
That's right.
when you're meeting with design and engineering, but there's lots of other stakeholders in that chain, whether it's on the marketing side or the finance side or even the customer side.
Oh, fantastic point. Yeah. It's an interesting thing about enterprise software development too. PMs have to wear a lot of different hats, but I
Hmm.
think a lot of them, and we all have different, touch points with other teams outside of the feature crew. But with enterprise software development, you also have to consider that, yes, there's a whole product marketing arm, there's documentation that needs to get written, there's a lot of cross dependencies. So for us to make something functional and work for our experience, we need to make sure that maybe another team's experience is done because we're depending on that. So there's a lot of cross team coordination as well. But that also is a good segue to prioritization. That becomes a really important aspect of this is you might have a really great idea and you might be able to frame it out and say, we're going to go build this. And then you start getting into the reality of, oh, well, how are we going to deal with this experience? Or what about this edge case? Or what about how are we going to accommodate this? And so you learn a lot as you really start to get
Yeah.
into it. And so having that flexibility to adjust based on where you're at
Mm.
is so important, which is why, again, early and iterative testing, customer feedback, and signal through the process is super important.
That's a great segue into the next thing, which is the other side of that process. I know there's always a bit of a tension between ship it or fix it. I'd love to kind of get your philosophy on the tension between minimally viable product versus minimally lovable product. Like, how do you reconcile those?
Mm. You know, one has to very quickly lead to the other, is what I think.
Okay.
I think that minimally viable products are super important to really validate, kind of like we also call them sometimes proof of life. Let's just make sure this
Interesting.
idea works. Let's make sure that this a prototype. Let's just test this out and see how this is going to work. And we've done that with a lot of things, like the autofill feature. We had very many different ideas, many of which ended up on the draw, no, the floor before
Right.
we got to an experience that made the most sense. And now some of the things that we're continuing to build and elaborate on top of that, I think are going to make it even more useful, more exciting. But, one of the things we try and do with a lot of features, they're not really quick one and done. So you have to validate it, but then you also want to get that customer signal and feedback and really make sure that you're aligning what may be data driven or maybe just an assumption like we think this is a good idea with customer signal. Is there market fit here? Let's make sure that we're building something that's going to be delightful, useful, lovable. So I think one needs to lead to the other fairly quickly.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you've just built a really cool feature, but if nobody's going to use it, so what? It's the tree that fell in the forest when no one's there, you know?
You used a fantastic word there, which is delightful. So,
Yeah.
delightful is a really hard thing to measure, to quantify. But what's the role of delight in product development?
You probably have heard this term, it's used in the industry as well. It's like creating these magic moments,
Hmm.
And I think that you know it, whenever you're building a feature, it's always need to think about you want to think about like where is there a delightful magical moment there. A lot of times delight could be the whole experience, like, oh my gosh, this is great, you guys are automating a function that was very manual and tedious for me before, so I can have delight in just the improvement overall. But I think another delightful aspect is you know creating a magical moment. A good example of that might be again, when we built autofill, one of the magic moments there was when you're testing or applying that prompt and it's processing a file. And what you used to have to do manually, all of a sudden, our system is reading the document, determining, answering the question, and capturing that response in the column. That's delightful. Um,
So, I'm going to pause you there for a second, Sean,
yeah.
because one thing, I've shared this with you before, but I find compelling also to compare your role to the role of an architect. I remember speaking to someone who worked at designing public spaces, and he
Okay.
said, it's this really interesting thing. Like, I help build a train station that is going to shape the way millions of people go to work every day, but they'll never know me and I never meet them. And so,
Yeah.
you've built a lot of things that have been used, I'm not exaggerating to say, tens to hundreds of millions of times. And so you mentioned something, autofill, which the audience may not know about. So I'm going to give you a chance to talk about that and meet the maker a little bit. What is autofill?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So
Yeah.
autofill, everybody should go use this. This is great. So um, we all store our content in SharePoint libraries, document libraries, and as many SharePoint users are aware of, you can improve the findability of that content or managing a workflow process or governance policy by having metadata on that document. So you can create columns and you can store information from the document or about the document. And then that information can get indexed, it can trigger a workflow, that type of thing. And a lot of, you could set up default values and things like this, but it's generally manual. And so we've done things over the years to kind of help improve the automation of that. Syntax models, some people may be familiar with, is a way to sort of say, I want to extract specific information from this document and save it in columns. So what
Mhm.
autofill does is it's an evolution of that. It actually allows you to put uh, a, a GPT prompt, an LLM prompt on the column. And it might be as simple as summarize this document in 50 words or less, or go grab the vendor name and put that information in the column. And it does it automatically when the file gets uploaded. And so you can imagine there's a huge productivity savings there. And so you could set up a number of autofill columns, and all of a sudden you've just automated the capture of that metadata.
Right. There's plenty of real powerful AI you can use to do document processing, to go in and build the complexity of saying, if the dollar value is over 10,000, look on this page to get the account number, otherwise go here. And if you if it's greater than 12, then grab that. And you can do that till the cows come home. But what I
Right.
loved about autofill the first time you showed it to me is it lets people just describe what they want in the ways that they would describe it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, tying that back to the something we mentioned before about old AI versus new AI.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really interesting about the evolution and of these large language models is they can generate metadata. right? So a lot of our old models, they would be really good at looking inside of a document and finding that entity, the vendor name, the invoice ID. But imagine now being able to say, hey, I want you to analyze this document. And if something's over 12, I want you to, write this type of response into the column. And so now it's not just extracting information directly from the document, it's generating new content based on the contents of the document. That's a powerful evolution
Yeah.
and change in what we can do with these experiences.
Yeah, we could probably spend the rest of this broadcast just talking about when to use metadata, when to use real-time AI, but like
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
interest of time, there's only so many hours in the day. But I do think that's a good example of another tension I want to get your thoughts on. Henry Ford famously and allegedly said, if all I did was give customers what they wanted, I would have just given them a faster horse.
Right.
Right.
Right. I love that.
So there's that, I think, split between giving customers what they want and coming up with something they never knew they needed. Like, and I think you sort of have to do both, don't you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, you know, I would characterize how I look at product development, and I think a lot of people do, is it's there you have to balance that customer focused philosophy. I mean, again, I think customer signal, understanding what the customer needs and delivering what they need
Right.
is vitally important to the success and market fit of your product. But you have to balance that with the data drivers as well.
Mm-hmm.
What's feasible to deliver, because part of the challenge that you have is if you have a competitive advantage in something, but then you're sitting on that for a long time doing analysis and trying to collect more data and do all those other things, then you might miss that window. And so I think oftentimes when we're building products that or features that are going to take a long time, you want to figure out how to break that thing down. So how can I, back to your minimally viable to minimally lovable, how do you build something that immediately can demonstrate value and deliver value and
Right.
maybe even respond to what that customer ask is, but then improve upon that and even go beyond that because the data indicates that if you do this much more, then the customers will be like, didn't even know I needed that, but that's fantastic. So I think it's an interesting balance that it kind of gets into prioritization. A lot of times when we're looking at building product, we have to prioritize, hey, we think we really need to do this first because there's strong signal for it. But we also know, based on our interpretation of the market and what people are actually doing, what the data is telling us, what these other signals are telling us, we also need to do these things. So
Right. I also think there's sometimes a need to pay attention to what others in the market, competitors are doing.
absolutely. I'm
Um,
sorry. Yes,
but
competitive analysis is very important.
but you also just can't spend your entire year filling check boxes in a feature matrix. So,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
Because if everyone does that, then every product's exactly the same thing. And so what's the point? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And how many times have I said to you and other people on the team, it's like, hey, what about this? It's like, it's in the backlog. So, we even if we have a great idea or we think that this is something we ought to do, it's not like we dismissed it. It might be something that, hey, we're not ready to get to that, or there's not a strong enough signal for that, or we just don't have the bandwidth to do that yet. I often feel like that's again gets into that prioritization discussion. I understand that's something that might be important to one group or might seem in the market a really important thing to go do, but there's other things that maybe take priority.
And there's terminology I've heard people use, which it's not a euphemism. It's like, well, we've had some design discussions about that. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean it will ship tomorrow, and it doesn't mean it's never happening. But there is
There
a
you go.
process of figuring out what can we fund. This is something we can do. Should we do it? Where does it sit next to the other things that are going on?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
I do think I've been privileged to look at the inside of Microsoft. I'll just observe that a lot of folks outside assume that Microsoft has infinite software development capacity, so can just do anything that anyone wants, anywhere, anytime. And have you ever encountered that in
I
your career?
wish that that was the case. If I'm sure your other guests have said the same thing. I mean, if we if we had a dollar for every time we, yeah, it would be fantastic to be able to deliver all the things. Because look, that's again back to the customer empathy. It's also just listening to the customer. I love all of the avenues that we have and opportunities whenever can. That's another aspect of my daily job is talking to customers, whether they're having problems or they have ideas or they're early adopters and I need their feedback. It's a fantastic opportunity to find out what people are thinking, what they're doing. And what's very cool is the things I learn from people. Like, you're doing what? That's really cool. I never thought about that use case before. I wish we could go make that better for you or go build that. And some of the best ideas I've heard or gotten have been from customers, MVPs, people in the community. They're the best.
Right. So let me ask you to think about this a bit. So the feature you described before, the autofill capability.
Yeah.
So you're building it on a stack that you're quite familiar with, which is, the entire lineage of SharePoint running through the cloud. You could also construct the capability completely separately, sort of as a pure play service that lives in Azure or some generic web service that people could wire in. I think you would approach that differently. Like, what are the pros and cons of working with a stack versus learning a stack that you don't know?
I'm doing a lot of that now. There's because well, a lot of the things that we're working on right now, we have, you know, always trying to improve the Copilot experience
Yep.
and, make the content and this metadata. I'm sure that people are aware of this, that we want Copilot to better understand and utilize metadata when, you're querying the contents of your SharePoint libraries, for example. And that requires understanding where are there things we can take advantage of and exploit in the search stack, and what are things that we need to go build there. And so I've been learning a lot about some of the pros and cons there. And that's an area, I know a lot about the search stack, but then there's aspects of it that I'm like, oh, I did not realize that that was there or that wasn't there. And so I think, you know, but I don't know if I'm answering your question insofar as when you work in the SharePoint stack, it's like, yes, I'm familiar with it. And there's certain things that I know I can take advantage of because I'm working in that stack. But I also know that there are constraints there. And I think you're familiar with this from the time when we worked together, that when we talked about intelligent doc processing, a lot of it also depends on what you're trying to build and for what audience. If you're a developer, and you're building like a custom app, you may just want to start at the metal and work straight with Azure. But then if you're doing other things in the Power Platform, you might want to work with AI Builder. But then if most of your content is in SharePoint and you want to do some of those same things, why not take advantage of all those layers we've already given you in the stack and start building on top of what we've provided? So I think a lot of it also depends on what, if I were to not use me, but somebody who's wanting to build on top of the various Microsoft pieces, it really depends on what you're trying to build and where that content or what the data is that you need.
Yeah, the best way I can fit that in, I was just thinking, I wasn't expecting to come up with so many musical references, but Irving Berlin, who was a songwriter, musician 100 years ago,
Yeah.
He could only play in the key of C, but he was successful enough. He had some magic piano with a lever that would move the keys up and down. So if he had to play in a different key, he only had to play on the white keys.
I did not know that. That's great.
So I would imagine it's actually like, I'm skilled in piano. When you change key on something, different things occur to you. And I would imagine, like, when you start working with a different tech stack, there's some things that you can't do and so you have to rethink, but there's some things it offers to you that it wouldn't offer to you on your original stack.
That's a great way, a great analogy. Yeah, because I think that when we're working, it's one thing when you can kind of, the benefit there, Chris, I would say, is it certainly expands your, vision and point of view, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're looking at something like, if I'm building a feature just for doc libraries and SharePoint, and then the list team comes along or the teams team comes along and says, hey, we want that to show up here, but there's a different set of constraints or opportunities for materializing or building that same feature to show up in that experience. That's where things get interesting. And interesting often in a good way, and also an opportunity to learn, but also an opportunity to partner with other folks. And that's one of the things I love about that, is it's like, and what also makes my job so interesting is while I have been working primarily in the SharePoint world for the last 20 years, I've actually been working with a lot of different teams across the company on different things, through that time. And it's given me the opportunity to get those different perspectives. Yeah. And I think it just makes me a better PM, I hope.
I'm less interested in how does AI transform the products you build, but how does AI impact the way you go about product development, the way you go about customer engagement?
Oh, that's a great question. The short answer, I'm still figuring that out, Chris. But I tell you, it has created it's resulted in a lot of interesting discussions and some pivots because one of the things that we're looking at now is, and I believe that I haven't had a chance to read this, but Steve Sinofsky recently blogged about some of the advantages of like, wow, you guys get all these optimization gains and from uh, offloading some of this stuff
Mhm.
into the AI, because it can start doing things for you, increase the productivity with these features. But now there becomes an evaluation process. Now we're back to the old AI versus the new AI. One of
Right.
the things that's really interesting that people are struggling with the new, generative AI is it's just that it's not consistent. If I'm working with a customer and they want to extract very specific information reliably and consistently, and they have a very narrow margin of variability that they can expect there, generative models still aren't quite there yet compared to those machine learned models where they were trained on 10,000 of the documents that look like this and the entity is going to be found there. Much higher reliability. You remember our syntax models,
Right.
they would have a 99%, you know, reliability rate with the values that they return. We're not quite there yet with some of these other scenarios. And so I think some of it is there's that aspect of variability, but the other piece is the way we're tackling that is with evaluation because we also don't know all the things that customers are going to do, and so we ask a question and say, hey, this looks good, but then Chris comes along and he asks, oh, we didn't think about that, and that there's a response we didn't expect. And so it's forcing for our design team and frankly as we develop product different interaction patterns. How are we going to make sure that the user, like you just mentioned earlier, the human is in the loop evaluating these things so it knows what the system is doing? Because if you as you offload more of these capabilities to these sort of black boxes, if you will, we need to make sure that we understand what the black box is doing.
Yeah. David Brunner is the CEO and founder of Module Q down in the Bay Area. And they're a AI. I don't want to call them a startup because they've been around a couple of years, but he's shown me a few white papers and a few examples that are exactly like you said, where generative AI, where the same question to be fair, two different systems, but with exactly the same training data are wildly opposite. Or the
Yeah.
same prompt on the same engine, just at different times, gives you different responses. And a few examples where, if you include an extraneous thing in your prompt, like, if you're like asking a question, um, what product did the customer buy most recently? And if you add like it's Tuesday on the end of it, how it just goes in a different direction.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Matter of fact, you reminded me of something that we're thinking about now, which other people closer to this will have much better perspective and insight here. But it's like even something where you might have to put, we wrap the content that somebody is, analyzing with a LLM with meta prompts. Those are
Mhm.
like guardrails, like just look at this content, reply with this tone, that type of thing. But the models, it's easy for a human to look at this and say, well, the answer I got last time was really nicely formatted, why wasn't it this time? Oh, well, maybe we need to add something to the prompt that says always come back if you have this kind of flavor of a
Right.
response formatted in a table or something like this, because you can't expect people to always say, let me format this in a table, just like you don't expect them to say where and give the column name equals. It's like we're not asking people to write SQL or KQL. We need them to be able to ask the system their question in natural language and expect a response that's consistent and understandable.
So, Sean, you definitely have a creative job, and I always learn a lot from it, asking creators what they study to keep being inspired.
Well, I'm fortunate to work with a bunch of incredible people within the
Mhm.
company and also just a community that's, thinking about this stuff and working with customers every day. And so I think there's just through all those channels and opportunities and, we do a lot of internal, brown bags and things like this. And so there's always learning opportunities. I also listen to quite a few podcasts and things like this just to understand what's going on in the world around me. But boy, it's hard to keep up with that. I don't know how some people like Jeff do it. Like they just seem to always kind of know what's on the horizon or what other folks are doing. And it's just enough to kind of, expand the circle of awareness even a little bit. But that's definitely one of the ways that I do it as, you know, staying apprised of just, podcasts and other brown bags and other learning opportunities for sure.
Yeah, podcasts are great. I will say sometimes I get overwhelmed by them. Like, there's a podcast that came up on a suggestion for me about the best way is to foster creative imagination. But like, there are 500 episodes, and each one is 2 hours long.
Right? Why are podcasts so long now? I don't understand this.
A podcaster who is walking through the 500 most important songs in rock history. Each episode is 3.5 hours long. Like, that is a year and a half of work life to listen to that podcast.
Yeah. And then I feel terrible because then I put them on double speed and everybody just talks like a chipmunk, but at least I can get to the salient points. Because a couple colleagues turned me on to Unsolicited Feedback. That's a good podcast for like just really interesting topics, but they're looking at like how do models analyze themselves and the quality of the responses that they're giving it. This was a talk Zach turned me on to last summer, and it was really interesting. Oh, this is great. But then sometimes these podcasts are just so long that, yes, I don't have the time to listen to them. The thing I've always wanted to do is people that are using AI to create podcasts grounded on content, and it builds an audio file for them, and then I could just listen to that on my walks or something like that on my runs.
Yeah, Google introduced that with Notebook LM. It's really fascinating.
What it is. Notebook,
we used it on one of the early episodes of this podcast as an example. I'm sure they've tuned it since then, because what it came up with, we fed it a blog post, and two people talked about it for 9 minutes, which is great. And then they went back and started talking about it again a little bit differently for another 6 minutes and repeated themselves. There is still role for the human in the loop.
There you go.
Let's keep the human in the podcast too. After hours, before hours, wherever it is, obviously folks plug into different parts of pop culture. So I'd love to hear about, is there a song or a book or a movie or a television program or something that you've experienced lately that's really connected and that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I'm not going to use Jeff's answer, The Pit, although I was watching that as well, and that is a great medical show. But I think
good thing about it.
Yes. But honestly, I'm a sucker for speculative fiction. I love science fiction and things like this. And so, a book I'm reading right now, Ministry of Time, is very interesting because it's exploring themes of like time travel, identity, and being displaced, and how you adapt in these different environments. And so that's one that I'm still reading it, but thus far it's certainly captivating. I think it was one of Obama's top reads last year. And so I don't recall how I stumbled upon it, but I'm enjoying it thus far. So
we'll have to put that in the show notes. Absolutely.
Yeah. And then a lot of times, as I mentioned, on my walks or runs, I will try and catch up on some business podcasts. But honestly, I've been finding more and more that I need time to sort of be creative and kind of step aside to, get some other perspective. And so listening to audiobooks on those walks, or even just music, Leon Bridges just came out with a new album. So if that's your style of music, I can't recommend his new album enough. So
for sure.
Yeah.
Sean Squires is a principal product manager at Microsoft. Thank you for being with us. What's the best way for the audience to stay in touch with you?
Thanks, Chris. It's been a pleasure talking with you this afternoon. I would say catch me on LinkedIn. That would probably be the best place. Yeah, right now. Yep.
Anyway, Sean, thanks for joining us in Polaris. Please come back soon.
Thanks, Chris. Take care, everyone.
We'll be right back. Up next on Polaris, events. It's one of the busiest times of the year for conferences and webinars. Here's what we're watching. The Business Strategy Masterclass, June 17th. Our own Matt Schaefer will present our new masterclass on how to develop and sustain business strategy with the Synozur Company OS. We have links to that on our website and in the show notes. And finally, wrapping up the first half of the year, Synozur will be sponsoring and speaking at TechCon 365 Seattle, being held at the Seattle Convention Center starting June 23rd. You can learn more at techcon365.com. We'll have links to all of that and more in the show notes. You can learn more at Synozur.com/events, and we'll add more events throughout the year. And if you have an upcoming event you'd like us to promote on Polaris, please get in touch and we'd be happy to include it. One final thought before we close. Earlier this week, my colleague Mark Cashman announced a pause on his long-standing podcast, The Intrazone. As many of you know, I've been a frequent co-host with him over the past 7 years. And while it's sad to see that chapter close, I have great hopes and expectations for what Mark will do in the next chapter. I've been proud to be speaking to many of you through the Intrazone, and will continue to bring that and more here to you on Polaris. Well, that's a wrap for another episode. I'd like to thank our guest, Sean Squires, for joining us and sharing his thoughts on product design and innovation. We encourage you to check out our show page for links to everything we talked about today and more. Visit us at polaris.synozur.com. Send us your questions and feedback for the Synozur team. You can reach us via email at polaris@synozur.com. Remember to rate, review, and tell all your friends about the show. Follow us wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Polaris is produced with help from Riverside.fm. Our theme song, Alternative Dream, is provided courtesy of Adobe. Additional music and sound provided by Indie Guy Records. Graphic design by Josh Brandon. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris McNulty, and this has been Polaris, a show that charts the course for business and technology transformation from Synozur. Learn more at Synozur.com. See you next time.